Good evening, everyone. State Representative Emanuel Welch here. Thank you for joining me again for yet another one of my Facebook Live conversations. Tonight, I'm bringing you a special edition of my Facebook Live conversation, and I have a very special guest, a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, who's going to be joining us here for a half hour of good conversation about our recent state budget. But before I get to him with questions, I want to just introduce you all to him because he represents the north side of Chicago. So a lot of us West suburban folks may not know him as well as I do. He is our House Majority Leader. That means he's number 2 behind the Speaker of the House. He's the state representative for the 13th district, which includes parts of Uptown, Ravenswood, Lincoln Square, North Center, West Ridge, and Bowmanville. He has been in the Illinois House since 2006, and he is the first openly gay person in Illinois to become a member of legislative leadership. He is openly living with HIV and was one of the first people to lead the charge to return to Springfield to work on behalf of the people to pass a fiscal year 21 budget to ensure that the state services continued uninterrupted. He is the chairman of our Rules Committee, very powerful committee in the House, and he is the go-to person on the state budget. I call him our House Chief Budgeteer. Please welcome my friend, leader, Greg Harris. Greg, how are you today, my man?
Well, I'm good. Thank you for the glowing introduction.
Thank you for joining me. I know you're a busy guy. You get a lot of questions and requests for meetings, and so I appreciate you making time to chat with us here tonight. Have you recovered from that intense session we just had?
It was interesting, but it was really good to actually go out in an area now where you could see and talk to your friends and colleagues and do stuff face to face. I mean, these video meetings are fine, but I for one just really miss personal interaction and a lot of conversations with folks. So it was good to get back to that. I'm glad it was very safe. I'm glad there were, everyone, came down there. We've all been quarantining. We've all been testing to be sure that we didn't bring, COVID back to our families or our communities. And so far, that's been successful.
Now, are you still quarantining, or have you had an opportunity to go out and be a part of any of the protests or anything like that?
I've been tested, so I know I'm good for that. Because I'm in a high risk category, I haven't gone to any of the protests. But last night, I really didn't have to go even off my porch because in Uptown we had there's different crowd estimates, 3,000 to 5,000 protesters.
Wow.
Came literally on the block next to mine is where they gathered to protest the murder of George Floyd. It was people from all over Chicago and the suburbs attended, from what I could see. Very well organized, very powerful messages. Left our area, walked down to Lakeshore Drive, walked along Lakeshore Drive, came back up my street, and then marched out. Very peaceful group, very impactful group. Sadly, though, about an hour after those folks had all left, we did have some incidents where outsiders, people who weren't from the neighborhood, weren't from the protest, showed up to do some looting. So, and sadly, that's what we're seeing all over Chicago.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part. I just returned home from a press conference with the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. We were on the south side where a strip mall had some extensive damage, and it was likely done by people that didn't even live in the neighborhood, and they were just provocateurs and opportunists. And I'll tell you, I don't condone burning cop cars and breaking into stores and doing things of that nature. But certainly we support the protests, and especially for this type of issue where unarmed, yet another unarmed Black person is murdered at the hands of police officers. We demand to be heard. and we demand justice and equality. But those who are out there just to be provocateurs and opportunists, I really believe they need to knock that off and don't let the message get lost. And it seems like that's happening all over the city, including your part of town.
Yeah, and sadly, a lot of the businesses that they hit were small neighborhood businesses where this is people's life savings. It's where their family works, and it's not like a big corporation. They're going to have a tough time, between going through the COVID epidemic and now something like this happening to them. It's going to be really hard.
It's going to be really hard, and I'm hoping, though, in our conversation tonight, there may be ways that folks that were hit by COVID and now those who have been hit by these provocateurs and opportunists who are looting businesses, maybe there's something we can do as a government to step in and help. Let me ask you this, Greg, just to set the tone. Can you tell us about the fiscal year 21 budget as we went into that special pandemic session? What was our objective? What were we hoping to accomplish, and did we accomplish it?
Well, I think for House Democrats in particular, we knew going in there that because of the COVID epidemic and because of loss of revenues as people stopped working, businesses stopped paying sales tax, that we were facing about a $7 billion revenue shortfall for the next year. And you were part of all of our meetings where we had to decide. I mean, there were really two ways we could go. We could go as a state the way some wanted us to go, which is just massive cuts and having to pass an austerity budget, and that would just trickle down to our school districts. It would be a loss of services, a loss of mental health support, a loss of childcare, all of those things. Or we could have taken the option, which is the one we chose. I'm really glad we did it, which is to become an island of stability, to give the state the resources to maintain stability and predictability, to keep services flowing out into communities, to make sure our school districts had enough money to operate for a full year, to keep our hospitals and health clinics operating right now more than ever where they need support, to be sure that our first responders, our nursing homes, had PPE and money for hazard pay for frontline workers. And that's the direction we took. We did all those things. And it's going to be tough. I mean, it was a hard budget to pass because a lot of it's going to rely on either the federal government coming through with support to Illinois and the other, 49 states. All the states are in the same position as we are.
Yeah.
Or we may have to do some borrowing from the Federal Reserve Bank. But I think what we felt and what you felt and I felt and we all voted for was we need to be a bulwark right now. We need to be a shield for our communities. We can't pass a scorched earth budget down to people. We can't have more layoffs. We can't have more business closures. So it was really important for us to be sure that the state of Illinois kept fulfilling its responsibilities.
Hey everyone, I am talking to the House Majority Leader, Representative Greg Harris from the 13th Representative District. Please share this feed with your friends because we're going to talk extensively here about the budget for the next half hour. And as the Chief Budgeteer, Greg is a wealth of information and knowledge, and you want to hear this information. Leader Harris, let me ask you this question. The special session that we were there for 4 days was called to address issues related to COVID-19. That was on the call for the meeting. How does this budget specifically address COVID-19? And specifically, how does it help disadvantaged communities? COVID-19 hit communities harder than others, like my community. How does it address COVID-19 and how does it help disadvantaged communities?
Well, we had to address a whole lot of things, from the fiscal aspect, the financial aspect of providing support to people, to also changing rules and laws to allow healthcare workers and emergency workers and first responders to work, through the epidemic in the way they needed to respond. Be sure their licenses were kept up. We needed to be sure that we required private insurance to pay for telehealth. As people were being told that their doctor's office was closing or that their hospitals were not able to do standard and routine procedures, standing up telehealth for our Medicaid customers in the state of Illinois, but also requiring all private insurers to offer telehealth and to reimburse providers for it was really a lifeline for a lot of people, particularly in the areas of mental health and substance abuse treatment, where those resources are really being taxed right now. The other thing that, one of the other things we did was provide about $700 million for PPE and hazard pay to be sure that our frontline workers have the support they need, whether they're working in a nursing home, a hospital, an FQHC, to protect themselves and their patients from COVID. And on PPE, I don't think, I certainly didn't realize, but in a normal nursing home setting, for instance, a worker will go through 14 sets of PPE per patient per day with the visits they need to go in and out of the room. You get into a more intensive care setting and in a hospital or ICU, they may be up to 26 or more sets per patient per day of PPE. And as we all know, when this hit, PPE costs went through the roof. So being sure that we were paying for that was important. Being sure we were paying hazard pay for frontline workers who are going in and doing this work, putting themselves and their families at risk, was important. Being sure we had facilities, if you tested positive for COVID and you didn't have a home setting where it was conducive for you to isolate from your family, giving people opportunity to go to hotel rooms and be able to isolate there. It's the same for frontline workers, nurses, doctors who had to work 12-hour shifts. It was difficult for them to get home to their families, making sure they were taken care of. Now that those kind of emergency needs are past, we're looking at how do we drive money into our business communities, into our cities and towns to help with the next step of recovery, which is helping with business interruption, helping with child care, helping our localities pay costs of their first responders.
Hey, Greg, actually, I want to mention that, hey, welcome to our audience here tonight. Republican Representative Tom Bennett is watching, and he appreciates us having this discussion here tonight. Also want to welcome one of our small business entrepreneurs, Ms. Vina Nelson, who wants to know where can we find the approved budget, and that's House Bill 264. You can go to www.ilga.gov and pull up 264. But also along with the budget is what we call it the Budget Implementation Bill, the BIMP. Greg, what was the bill number for the BIMP? Was that 357?
That's House Bill 357, yeah.
House Bill 357. So if you go to www.ilga.gov and look up House Bill 264, that is the budget bill. And then the BIMP bill is HB 357. So welcome. And with Vina being on the line watching, I want to ask this question. Many small businesses across the state have been hit extremely hard due to COVID-19. And now many businesses are being hit by looters. And so they're getting hit by a double crisis. Governor Pritzker has declared a disaster for both COVID-19 and for the looting in 9 different counties across the state. Greg, what does this budget do to help small business owners, and is it real money?
Yeah, we're going to be rolling out a small business assistance program to help businesses who were interrupted by COVID. It's going to have a couple different levels in it. For business interruption costs, direct business interruption costs, there'll be $165 million set aside for Northeastern Illinois. But we're also looking at everything in our budget this year with an equity lens. So besides passing a general budget for the state, we've also identified specific money set aside for the most heavily impacted communities that have the highest impact from COVID, along with underlying disparities. So for the business interruption, there'll be another $60 million for underserved communities who have had heaviest impact from COVID. There's another set of money available, about $157 million for child care services in northeastern Illinois, and $25 million for disproportionate share, disproportionately affected communities. We've also put in place money for housing, rental, and mortgage assistance for folks who are struggling. And again, that's stratified between a general set for all of northeastern Illinois, but being sure we set aside a separate amount for disproportionately affected communities. And if you remember the news of when Congress passed the PPP program for businesses, and this was going to help small mom and pop businesses, but at the end of the day, it all a whole bunch of it went to Fortune 500. So we're trying to be sure that doesn't happen here.
Well, that's great, and that's why I asked. And one of the things I think that you and I talked about extensively toward the last couple of days of the special session was making sure there was technical assistance dollars in the budget to help these small businesses, and we got that done. And what does that look like, Greg?
And that's going to be coming out of DCEO. Also, they're writing the rules and regs right now. Because again, you point out a good thing, that even with the companies who wanted to take care of PPP or take advantage of PPP, I mean, the rules are complex. They may not have lawyers or accountants on call that they could just summon up to help fill out the applications and gather the documents. So we want to be sure that we give assistance to small businesses to do the application process too.
There's a lot of people that are struggling right now because of COVID-19. They're getting eviction notices, they're getting foreclosure notices. And like I said, I don't condone looting in any way whatsoever. But I think when you have people that are sitting at home, they don't have any income coming in, they've been at home for the last 2.5, 3 months, they're struggling and can't get through on our flooded unemployment system. People are really frustrated, and they're worried about how are they going to pay their rent and keep a roof over their head. How does this budget address those who are in need of mortgage and rental assistance?
And we set aside a substantial amount of money for that. That's going to be distributed through a emergency rental and mortgage assistance program out of the Illinois Housing Development Authority. And I know exactly what you mean. One of the bigger employers in my area are the hospitality industry and the convention and tourism industry in hotels in the city of Chicago. Hundreds and hundreds of folks work in that up here. And that's shut down for the foreseeable future. So there are people really struggling every day, how they're going to get through things. And we really want to be a help for them.
The things we're talking about, has the budget been sent to the governor yet for him to sign it?
It's on its way to the governor, and it will have to be signed by him. But remember, our fiscal year doesn't start till July 1.
So even if he gets it and signs it, this budget, he can't spend that money until July 1?
He can start spending that money, some of it prior to July 1, so that we did in a FY20 supplemental, but the bulk of it will kick in July 1. But all the preparation work, the applications can start now, so that when the budget goes live, our fiscal year starts, they can begin processing payments.
That's important for folks to know, because they're going to expect this money to start flowing as soon as possible. And so when the governor signs it, at least that allows you to start getting the ducks in a row so that come July 1, things are in place and money can start flowing. You mentioned early on at the top how the budget helps local governments. In what way?
Well, in a number of ways. We've set aside several $100 million where they can apply to have direct COVID-related costs reimbursed by the state. So for instance, PPE for their fire, police, ambulance services, that kind of thing. The other thing we've done is given a 100% proration of what, and this is sort of inside baseball talk, but what's called the Local Government Distributive Fund. But the cities and villages and towns in Illinois all count on the state for a share of their revenue. We collect it in the sales taxes that come into the state, and then rebate some to our localities. And we've increased that rebate by 5% this year, knowing that they're struggling on their own, and we want to be as supportive as we can.
They need every little bit they can get. And it's inside baseball to us, but trust me, the local government people that are watching truly appreciate the little bit that we were able to get to them. I was recently asked about park districts, and I know that there was a back and forth about OSLADs at one point, and we kept the OSLAD grant in the budget. What else did we do to help local park districts, which are the heart of many communities? Are they eligible for COVID-19 assistance?
If you go into the details of it, then when the federal government distributed money to the states and the counties, they sent one separate portion to the state of Illinois. They sent a different portion to the 5 counties in the state that had populations of over 500,000. So essentially the collar counties, and then another split separately to the city of Chicago because of its size. Congress, I think when they did this, it seems their intent, at least Congress people I've talked to have said that their intent was then that the counties would share with local units of government, including school districts, park districts, that kind of thing. But it wasn't explicit. So I think it's an ongoing question. It's one the legislature is going to get involved in. We've established an oversight committee to look at how the counties are spending this money and trying to make sure that some of it goes down to the smaller units of government who also had expenses and need some help, and doesn't all stay at the county level.
One of the things we did to possibly help pay for this budget, if the federal government does not pass another stimulus bill and send money to the states and local governments who have been hit hard by COVID-19, we did pass a bill to authorize the state to borrow $5 billion. Can you explain that a little bit? Are we necessarily going to go straight to borrowing that money?
No. I think our plan there was trying to, plan for every eventuality. I mean, we came into an emergency session for 3 days to pass a budget that had to be durable enough to fit every contingency in a really uncertain world right now. I mean, we don't know what the revenue picture is going to be for the state or for any of our cities or towns with COVID. And remember, this all came before even the activity we're seeing now related to George Floyd and others. So we were facing a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know if we're going to be able to go back in November to pass a supplemental budget because a lot of people say COVID will continue along during the summer, but there'll be a huge spike in November, and we might not be able to go back and address open budget issues. So we wanted to give maximum flexibility to the governor. So we chose using what's called the municipal liquidity facility, which is part of the Federal Reserve Bank, to backstop any potential future revenue loss we might have. And then if the federal government does come through for the states, whether it be Illinois or any of the others, with state support, that will fill our federal resources gap in the budget. We won't have to do any borrowing, and that's certainly the best case scenario. But we wanted to plan for every scenario on down to the absolute worst.
Exactly. We hope for the best, but we planned for the worst.
Right.
And that's pretty much what that borrowing authority is we're planning for if things don't necessarily work out the way we're hoping for. And I especially while we're still in the midst of this crisis, let's understand the virus is still out there and the legislature is not going back and forth to Springfield. It was important to give statutory authority while we were there in case we ever need it. I think that's the best way to sum that up, right?
Yep.
We only have about 6 minutes left, Leader. For those who don't understand how this whole budget process works, can you give us an abbreviated overview of how it all comes together? This isn't something you just throw on the board and say, vote for it?
Well, this year was a little different than typical years, but in a typical year, we would have had months of public hearings on all of the lines in our budget. Members of community advocates would have come in and testified, but of course, because of the virus this year, our hearing schedules got cut way back because we couldn't go to Springfield. The legislature was not in session. We did do our best in the last couple months with Zoom calls with different advocacy organizations and our appropriation committees, and then sat down with the House and the Senate and the governor all have to approve a budget for it to be passed. So we had to be sure that all the needs of those folks were addressed. And I think all of us were really concerned with, we have to be sure that everyone in the state is covered, whether you're in Chicago or far southern Illinois or central Illinois or the suburbs around Chicago, that we had looked at how COVID in particular was impacting those communities. But then we also this year took extra effort to be sure that every single line in our budget addressed communities with disparate impacts, with disproportionate share of health disparities, of economic disparities, of different social determinants of health. And we actually wrote language into the budget that said every expenditure made by the governor, every direction of money needs to be looked at essentially through an equity lens, and that's spelled out what that means. And in addition, for all of these really key areas, child care, housing relief, mortgage relief, employment relief, business relief, we also identified separate pots of money that would be used, that could only be used in those communities with disproportionate share, to be sure that we were sending the help where it was clearly the most needed and deserved.
With all the work that went into preparing this budget, and you work on it more so than anyone as the chief budgeteer, were you surprised that all of the Republicans were down on the budget?
Again, we made a decision to go a certain way. I think there were others who said, we should just cut. There should be no borrowing. We need to, cut back. That was not the way a lot of us felt. We felt we need to stand strong right now, not be going to a scarcity budget. And so I think that's just where it ended up. Two different philosophical points.
Our colleagues left town and they all put out press releases and videos that really have people irate, sending us emails and talking about raises that legislators gave themselves. Let me ask you this, Leader Harris, Chief Budgeteer, did we give ourselves raises?
No, and if you go and look at the budget, you could see a big zero in that line.
Yeah, and is that in the budget, HB 264?
That's in the budget. There's just a zero where that number would have been a zero.
Zero. There's no money appropriated for raises. And so the comptroller does not have legal authority to pay raises because the budget document says zero.
Zero.
That's pretty straightforward.
Politics, but zero.
Let me ask you this, as the sponsor of the bill that put the language on the ballot for the fair tax question, I want to ask you, is this budget dependent on the fair tax referendum in November?
No, it is not.
What happens if the fair tax referendum doesn't pass in November? Does it impact this budget in any way at all?
No, the way we've constructed the budget is that there are fail-safe mechanisms in there that if the fair tax doesn't pass, we would not have to make across-the-board cuts. That's sort of baked into the calculation. If the fair tax does pass, then I think that will help us do a number of things. It will help us, as the governor wanted to do, make additional payments to paying down our pension liability, for example. It would go toward paying down our backlog of bills. It would go toward doing an increase for the evidence-based model for funding our local school districts. So there are things we could do to supplement what we've already done.
Excellent. Would you characterize this budget as a level budget compared to last year's budget?
I think in general, you could say, what we did not spend beyond our FY20 levels. You'll see some increases in a couple areas. DCFS, which is woefully in need of support right now. We've all seen the horrible headlines. We wanted to be sure they had the resources. We wanted to be sure that we allowed our service providers to meet their obligations under the minimum wage law. So there were some rate increases for those who serve seniors in their homes and people with developmental disabilities to make sure that those agencies can meet their minimum wage requirements. So you'll see a couple things like that.
Leader, just as you said that, and just like I told you before, that is the fastest 30 minutes of my day. I see my time is up. I'm going to ask you one final question before we go. Now that we're home, we're not scheduled back until November 17th for a veto session. It's summer and fall. Anything you're looking forward to doing, especially as the state's reopening here?
I think something, and viewers out by you who went through the Westlake Hospital closure, know that one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is rethinking our healthcare system, particularly in the wake of COVID. How are we going to pay for and plan and organize our healthcare delivery? Because the whole world has changed there. A lot of the things we had thought of in the past as settled ways of doing business, that's upended. So I think we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at healthcare delivery, how it's paid for, how people are able to access it. And I think that's going to be a big project over the summer.
Always working, always working. That is Leader Greg Harris from the 13th District. Really appreciate you taking time out of the day to talk to us a little bit about the fiscal year 21 budget. I know I took a lot out of this conversation. I'm sure our viewers did here tonight. So I really appreciate you, Greg, and stay safe and stay well, my friend.
Thank you, and thanks all for tuning in.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.